everyone. In today's lecture, we'll be starting a new chapter which is on respiration and circulation. And today we'll be specifically discussing the topics about plant respiratory surfaces and we'll be ending with a slight overview of the human respiratory system. Alright, so let's get started. First, let's try to understand what exactly is the need for oxygen. Why do we need oxygen? If you see, all of these cellular respiratory processes that happen, which are important for metabolism, require oxygen either for oxidation or as a final acceptor. And since these processes are important for generation of ATP or giving us energy, oxygen is one of the most important elements which is responsible for keeping us alive, right? So, this is one of the reasons we make so many efforts for optimal oxygen intake from the environment. Now, this optimal oxygen intake from the environment also requires an optimal respiratory surface which will help take in a good amount of oxygen. Here, we have certain characters which are important for a respiratory surface to be a good oxygen transporting surface. For example, here we're talking about high surface area. If you see this structure versus this structure, you can visualize that more surface area is occupied by the rigid structure than a plain structure. So, all of our respiratory surfaces that we observe in nature consists of high surface area structure so that more oxygen can be taken in, which helps in taken in. Then we have structures which need to be really thin, vascular and permeable. Now, the more thin and permeable the structures are, the better or less resistance will be provided for the oxygen to be transported, and high vascularity ensures that the vasculature around the oxygen will be in closer proximity to the blood and moist. Now, the moisture is required because if you see the gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide are readily soluble in some aqueous medium, then it is then they can be gaseously exchanged. Hence a moist surface is really important for oxygen transport. Now let's talk about how these plants take in oxygen, right? If you see, there is a green stem here, there are green leaves here, and these green structures show presence of stomata which act as structures for intake of oxygen and expelling of carbon dioxide in case of respiration. Here it is showing a photosynthetic pathway. So these stomata structures in green regions are responsible for oxygen intake. And then in the roots, if you see, roots don't exactly have stomatal structures. They are usually brown. They do not have photosynthetic uh, process in most cases. But what happens in roots is that these roots are present in the soil, which consists of spaces wherein air is present. Now, this air is continuously circulated and hence there is some amount of oxygen present here. That oxygen dissolves in the capillary water which is present between the soil particles, and through this aqueous medium it enters into the soil. So that is a very smart way of taking in oxygen even from roots, right? And then we come to trees like these. If you see, the bark isn't green. If you see, actually there's a bark, right, which is really thick and it is impermeable to any kind of air. So what do these trees do? They have these structures, these tiny structures known as lenticels. Now these lenticels form a, a pathway for the air or the oxygen to enter into the air spaces, and thus the plant can make use of this oxygen. Cool, right? Now that we are done with the plant respiratory surfaces, let's start with human respiratory system. A human respiratory system is divided into two parts, the upper respiratory system and the lower respiratory system. The upper respiratory system is essentially formed of your nose, which consists of external nerves, nasal cavities, the internal nerves, and the lower respiratory system consists of your larynx, which is also your voice box, your trachea, your bronchi, which branch in, and your two whole sacs of lungs. Alright, now let's come to our nose. This is an integral part of your upper respiratory system, and the nostrils that you call are slit-like openings which help take in oxygen. These are also known as external nares. The nostrils continue into nasal chambers. Now if you see, you have one and two nasal chambers. These chambers are formed by a separation, and this separation is known as your septum. This septum is made up of your mesenteroid cartilage, which is slightly bony in nature. All right. Now, once we've discussed the external part of it, the nares, let us see what forms the internal part of your nose. So, if I look sideways, this is how the internal structure will look, and you will notice that it is a huge dome-shaped structure, and the first proximal region, the nearest region to your external nares, consists of a vestibular region. This is the region you will notice that you have a lot of hair, and that hair is very important for filtering, and it also helps trap dust particles. So any kind of particulate matter in the air is filtered in your proximal area, which is known as your vestibule, which is present in the proximal area of the nasal chamber before it is sent inside for exchange of gases. The second region, which is a little further inside, is known as your conditioner area, and this is relatively softer, and because this has lots of blood vessels, it is highly vascular, and the function of having blood vessels there is to moist and warm the air which is going inside. And then in the most distal part of a nasal chamber is present sensory region. The sensory region, as the name suggests, is used for your sense of smell because it contains neurons which are olfactory in nature. They will help in comprehending what is the fragrance or the odor that is passing through your nose. It has olfactory epithelium. Alright. Now let's go a little further back. After our nose is present our pharynx. Now this pharynx is divided into three types: the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. The nasopharynx, this is where your sensory region has ended, and this nasopharynx has begun just where your sensory region has ended, and it's called nasopharynx because it is nearer to your nasal area or your nasal chamber, and it continues into the oropharynx. That is because just after your pharynx continues into your just after your nasal chamber continues into a pharynx, the oral chamber also continues into the pharynx. So this is a common region where both of them are present together. So this is the area, this pharynx, the pharynx which is present in this area is known as your oropharynx. And then again it separates into either your laryngopharynx, then it continues into your laryngopharynx. Alright. Now this nasopharynx, and before oropharynx starts, there is a region which forms the soft palate. That is just, you can touch it if you move your tongue. distal enough in your mouth. Alright. Now your laryngopharynx is so named because it continues into your larynx. Your larynx is a tubular structure. It has lots and lots of ligaments and cartilage in the supporting area, and you have the hyoid bone which is present just where your larynx is starting. This larynx has vocal cords which are present inside, and these are elastic in nature. Now, these vocal cords are very important for your speech production. When you're trying to say something or you are saying something, the voice or speech is modulated based on how you move your lips, your tongue, your teeth, and how your vocal cords vibrate, right? So your vocal cords are really, really important for language production. Further on, this larynx continues into your trachea. Now, before the trachea starts, we have this region known as the epiglottis, which is present just above the larynx. Now, larynx is also known as your glottis, and the flap which is present above. So, this is your laryngeal region and this is your esophagus. So, your larynx just lies over here and your esophagus lies behind the larynx. This larynx has this flap, this is the flap, it is known as an epiglottis. Since it is present above the glottis, it is known as epiglottis. Now, this epiglottis helps prevent the movement of food from, so we saw that the pharynx is, there is a small common region, right, the oropharynx. From there, that area, there is a possibility sometimes the food might just move into the windpipe, which is the trachea. To prevent that from happening, we have a structure known as epiglottis, which functions in closing the mouth of the glottis. So let's watch this video to understand it better. So if you see, let's watch it again. If you notice, this person has swallowed the food, and when the food entered into the oropharyngeal region, this epiglottis closed. The flap just came down so that the laryngeal opening just closed and the food successfully went into the food pipe, which is your esophagus, than the larynx. Alright. Now, let's try to understand what is present in the trachea, which is the further part of the larynx. Alright. Now, our trachea is the windpipe, and this larynx and trachea, all of these are supported by small discs, semicircular discs, which prevent them from collapsing. And internally, they show pseudostratified epithelium, which is present. Pseudostratified because you can see that it looks like it has layers of cells, but it is not stratified. It is just one cell which is giving the appearance of such layers, and hence it is known as a pseudostratified epithelium. And it has cilia, and also it has goblet cells which help produce mucus. Now these mucus and cilia which are present inside help in successful movement of sputum which is produced, and the mucus helps collect the particles which manage to escape the hair from your vestibular region. But once they reach the trachea secretes mucus, and since it is very viscous in nature, this mucus can trap these particles, and the cilia push them upwards, and that is how your sputum is formed. And this is one of the best modifications that you will observe in your body. The trachea as I said, consists of cartilaginous rings which are holding it. So you have a tracheal ring, so then so, then so, then so. So these rings help prevent the trachea from collapsing because it's essentially a muscular pipe, right? And also your laryngeal area has a cartilaginous structure which is holding it, and just above it is the hyoid bone. If you notice, this trachea has continued into bronchi, singular bronchus. These bronchi are divided into a right one and the left one. The right bronchus enters the right lung, the left bronchus enters the left lung. It further divides into secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, and bronchioles. Alright, and the primary bronchus is the one which enters the lung. As you can see here, the primary bronchi have entered the lungs, and they divide to form secondary and tertiary bronchi, and then further they form bronchioles. These bronchioles consist of alveolar sacs which are present at the tip of them. These look like small lobular grape-like structures. Now, if you remember that we talked about the importance or the specific characters that a respiratory surface should contain, these alveoli will show all of those characters. These alveoli are really thin, they are permeable, they are highly vasculated. You will see that there is a pulmonary arteriole and a pulmonary venule which is taking away the oxygenated blood, and the pulmonary arteriole which is bringing the deoxygenated blood, and the pulmonary venule which is taking away the oxygenated blood, and the alveoli are the sites where the oxygen exchange is happening. And there is also an aqueous coating around the alveoli, so it is also ticking off the boxes for a moist surface. It is highly vascularized, and since these alveoli tick off all the boxes for it to be a good respiratory surface, optimal amount of oxygen exchange happens, gaseous exchange basically. Now that we have talked about the alveoli, the bronchi, the tracheal tube, the larynx, which is your voice box, the pharynx, and your nasal chamber, let's come to the biggest aspect of our respiratory system, which is your lungs. Lungs are basically huge sac-like structures which contain these primary bronchi and your alveoli, and this is a very specific site for gaseous exchange present in mammals, and these are protected by ribs, and the walls of the lungs are made up of a double layered membrane. It is known as a pleural membrane. So the outer pleural membrane is known as the parietal, and the inner pleural membrane is known as the visceral membrane. And between these two membranes, you will see there is a pleural space which is filled with the pleural fluid. Alright. Now these lungs are also divided into lobes. The right lung is divided into 3 lobes, whereas the left lung is divided into 2 lobes. These lungs rest on a floor called as a diaphragm, which is dome shaped when it is relaxed, and when it is contracted it forms a line. It forms a horizontal line. It's not domed anymore, and this essentially marks the ending of your thoracic cavity. So your respiratory system begins with your external nares, continues into the nasal chamber, which constitutes of your vestibule, your conditioner region, and your sensory region. Then it goes into your nasopharynx, your oropharynx, and your laryngopharynx. Now this larynx is also known as your glottis, and above it there is a flap present which is known as your epiglottis. So when you feed and there is a morsel which is supposed to go into the esophagus, this epiglottis closes so that it successfully enters into the esophagus and doesn't enter into the tracheal pipe. Further on, this trachea is supported by cartilaginous rings and it has pseudostratified epithelium for successful movement of mucus and also entrapment of foreign particles. This trachea continues into bronchi, the primary bronchi, one of which enters into the right lung, the other enters into the left lung. These bronchi further divide to form secondary and tertiary bronchioles and bronchi, and finally bronchioles, which end into alveoli. These alveoli are the site of gaseous exchange, and somewhere I guess I missed saying it, but these tonsils are also present just where your pharynx ends. So that is where your tonsils are present, and so that is more or less it for today. If you have any questions, please ask. Thank you.